My husband said he needed space to clear his head, so I stepped back and gave him time. 2 weeks later, my best friend posted beach photos, and there he was, smiling right behind her. I stared at my phone screen until the image burned into my vision, not just behind her. His hand was on her shoulder. They were wearing matching sunglasses. I called him first. Voicemail. I called her second. Same thing. So I did what any rational person would do and scrolled through every single photo she'd posted in the last month, looking for clues I'd missed. There they were. Coffee shop selfies where his reflection showed in the window, a casual sunset walk post where his shoes appeared at the edge of the frame, a restaurant photo where the waiter accidentally captured both of them at a table for two. They'd been together the entire time he was supposedly finding himself. I sat there in our apartment, surrounded by his things he'd left behind when he moved into that temporary rental. His favorite mug still sat in the dish rack. His toothbrush stood in the holder. He'd promised it was just for a few weeks while he figured things out. While he dealt with work stress and personal issues he couldn't quite articulate. I'd believed him, supported him, told my friends and family he was going through something and needed space. Now I understood why Becca had been so distant lately, why she'd stopped answering my texts as quickly, why she'd suddenly been too busy for our standing Thursday dinner dates. She'd been busy with my husband. I screenshot every photo, every comment, every tag. Then I opened my laptop and started digging deeper. His credit card statements, I still had access from when we'd combined finances. Hotel charges in the same beach town where Becca had posted those photos. Dinner receipts from romantic restaurants. Flower purchases the same day she'd posted a vague someone special surprised me story that I'd assumed was about some new guy she was seeing. It was my guy, my husband. My phone buzzed. A text from him saying he'd been thinking about me and wanted to talk soon, that he was ready to work on us. I stared at those words. At the casual way he suggested reconnecting after 2 weeks of lying to my face while sleeping with my best friend. I didn't respond. Instead, I called a lawyer, filed the paperwork that same afternoon, changed the locks on our apartment that evening, legally within my rights since only my name was on the lease. Then I waited. 3 days later, he showed up at the door with flowers and that apologetic smile. The smile bounced off the new deadbolt. Through the door, I told him to check his email. I heard him pull out his phone, heard the silence as he opened the divorce papers I'd sent with every single photo attached. Every receipt. Every piece of evidence of his beach vacation with my former best friend. He tried explaining, said she was going through something and needed support, that he was just being a good friend. I reminded him through the door that good friends don't share hotel rooms, or delete their location history, or block their wife's number while on romantic dinner dates. He left, shouting threats about lawyers and fighting for half of everything. But he'd forgotten something crucial. The apartment was mine. The car was mine. The savings account he'd never bothered to contribute to was mine. He'd spent the last 2 years coasting on my income while his startup failed, living off my generosity while planning his exit strategy with my best friend. What he didn't know was that I'd found something else while digging through our accounts. Transfers to Becca. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums. He'd been funneling our money to her for 8 months. The next morning, Becca finally called. She said we needed to talk. I told her we didn't. She started explaining how it just happened, how they didn't mean for it to go this far. I was about to hang up when she said something that made my blood run cold. He'd told her I knew. He said I'd agreed to an open relationship and was seeing someone else too, that I was fine with everything. I sat down on the couch, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. He'd constructed an entire lie, made me the villain in a story where I didn't even know I had a role. I asked Becca what else he'd said about me. She hesitated. Then the words came tumbling out. That I'd been emotionally distant for years. That I'd refused couples therapy. That I'd told him I wanted out but was too afraid to leave. That I'd already started dating someone from work. Every single word was a lie. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer. There was no coworker. I'd begged him to go to therapy with me 6 months ago when I felt us drifting apart. He'd refused, saying we didn't need outside help. And emotionally distant? I'd been planning a surprise trip for our anniversary next month, trying to reconnect. Becca went quiet when I told her the truth. When I explained that I'd spent the last 2 weeks crying myself to sleep, worried about him, that I'd defended him to my family who'd questioned why he needed space, that I'd turned down dinner invitations because I thought he'd be coming home soon, and I wanted to be there when he did. Her voice changed, got smaller. She asked if I was lying, if this was just me trying to get him back. I sent her the texts, the ones where I'd asked him how he was doing during his space period, and he'd responded with short answers about needing more time, the ones where I'd said I loved him and supported whatever he needed. She didn't respond for a long time. When she finally spoke again, she said he'd shown her texts too, ones where I was supposedly cold and dismissive, where I told him I didn't care if he came back. I asked her to send me screenshots. She did. My stomach turned. The contact name said my name. The profile picture was one of me. But those weren't my words. He'd fabricated an entire text conversation, changed someone else's contact information to my name and taken screenshots. I don't know who he'd really been texting. Maybe no one. Maybe he'd used some app to create fake conversations. But he'd built an elaborate lie to justify what he was doing, to make himself the victim and me the bad guy. Becca started crying, saying she didn't know. She never would have gotten involved if she'd known the truth, that he'd been so convincing, so hurt. She'd felt sorry for him. I wanted to scream at her that she should have talked to me first, that best friends don't sleep with your husband without at least checking your side of the story. But I also understood manipulation, How good liars make you believe anything. I told her I needed to go, that I couldn't process this right now. She kept apologizing, but apologies don't fix betrayal. They just make the person saying them feel better. I called my lawyer back, told her about the fake text messages. She said to document everything and that this would actually help our case. Then I called my sister. She'd been suspicious from the start, had told me something felt off about his sudden need for space. She came over that night with wine and takeout, and let me cry on her shoulder for 3 hours. The next week was a blur. He tried calling 47 times, left voicemails that started apologetic and ended angry, sent emails ranging from love letters to legal threats, showed up at the apartment twice more, both times finding the locks unchanged and me unwilling to open the door. The second time, I called the police. They couldn't do much since it was technically still his legal residence, but they told him he needed to make an appointment to collect his belongings. He showed up the following Saturday with his brother. I'd boxed everything already, clothes, books, his computer equipment, even that hideous lamp his mother had given us. I wanted no trace of him left. While his brother loaded boxes into their truck, he tried one more time to talk to me, said we could work through this, that everyone makes mistakes, that 7 years of marriage meant something. I told him those 7 years had meant something to me too, right up until I discovered he'd spent the last 8 months of them lying, cheating, and stealing from me. He tried to deny the money transfers, said those were loans. I pulled out the bank statements I'd printed, highlighted every transaction, asked him what exactly Becca needed $23,000 in loans for over 8 months. He didn't have an answer. His brother looked uncomfortable, started walking faster to the truck. Before they left, I handed him one more box. Inside were all the photos from our wedding, our honeymoon, every anniversary. I'd cut myself out of every single one. He could keep his memories. I was erasing mine. The divorce moved quickly once I provided all the evidence. The fake text messages were particularly damning. My lawyer hired a digital forensics expert who proved they'd been fabricated using an app designed for exactly that purpose. The money transfers spoke for themselves. His lawyer tried to argue for spousal support since he'd been unemployed. Mine countered that he'd been unemployed by choice while stealing from our joint accounts. The judge was not sympathetic to him. I got everything. The apartment, the car, full reimbursement for the money he'd transferred, and he had to pay my legal fees. The whole process took 4 months. 4 months of him trying different tactics, pleading, threatening, sending his mother to guilt trip me, sending his friends to tell me I was overreacting. None of it worked. Becca tried to reach out twice, once to apologize again, once to tell me they'd broken up. Apparently once he didn't have me to blame, his real personality came through. He'd started treating her the same way, asking for money, disappearing without explanation. She'd found messages between him and another woman. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't respond to either message. 6 months after I first saw that beach photo, the divorce was finalized. I was sitting in my apartment, our apartment, my apartment now, drinking coffee and feeling lighter than I had in years. My sister came over to celebrate. We ordered pizza and watched terrible reality TV, and I realized I was genuinely happy. The next day I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Becca's mother. She'd always been kind to me, had treated me like a second daughter. She said she needed to tell me something, that she'd found something while helping Becca move, a storage unit key and his belongings. Becca had been curious and checked it out. Inside was furniture. My furniture. The antique dresser my grandmother had left me. The desk I'd inherited from my aunt. Pieces I thought he'd sold during his financial troubles 2 years ago when his startup was failing. Pieces he'd told me he'd gotten terrible money for, but it was necessary to keep us afloat. He'd never sold them. He'd stored them, probably planning to retrieve them after the divorce and sell them for real. Becca's mother gave me the storage unit information, said she thought I should know. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there for a long moment processing this new betrayal. Even the financial hardship story had been a lie. We'd never been as desperate as he'd claimed. He'd just wanted to pocket money while stashing valuable items for later. I drove to the storage unit that afternoon, used bolt cutters on the lock since I didn't have a key. Inside was everything he'd claimed to sell, furniture worth at least $15,000. I called a moving company and had it all brought back to my apartment. Then I called my lawyer again. We filed an additional claim for fraud and theft. The furniture had been mine before the marriage, family heirlooms, which made it clearly separate property. He'd stolen and hidden it. The case was straightforward. He had to pay me the appraised value of the furniture, which came to $18,000 after a professional evaluation. He tried to claim he'd been storing it for safekeeping, that he was planning to surprise me with it. The judge asked him why he'd told me he'd sold it, why he'd kept the storage unit a secret, why he hadn't mentioned it during the divorce proceedings. He had no good answers. I won. But the biggest win came 3 months later. I was at a coffee shop working on a design project when I overheard 2 women talking. They were discussing someone they knew who'd been scammed by a guy using fake text messages to manipulate his girlfriend into thinking his wife was abusive. One of the women mentioned his name. I turned around, asked if they were talking about my ex-husband. They looked startled, but confirmed. I told them my story, showed them the court documents on my phone, the evidence of his lies. One of the women pulled out her phone and called someone, her cousin, who'd been dating him for the last month. We met up later that week. The cousin, her name was Deirdre, was 24. He'd told her he was 29 and single. He was actually 34 and recently divorced. He'd been using the same playbook, complaining about a crazy ex, showing fake messages, asking for money to help with legal fees from his vindictive former wife. Deirdre had already given him $3,000. I showed her everything, the divorce records, the fraud case, the evidence of his fake text app. Her face went white. She'd believed every word. She broke up with him that night and filed a police report for fraud. I provided statements and evidence to support her case. That wasn't the only woman who came forward. Over the next month, 2 more contacted me through social media. He'd been running the same scam on multiple women simultaneously. All young, all believing his sob story about an abusive wife. All giving him money for various crises that didn't exist. The police built a case. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud. Last I heard, he was looking at significant jail time. His lawyer tried to reach out to me, suggesting I could help him by testifying that he wasn't always like this, that he'd been a good husband at some point. I declined. My sister asked me if I felt guilty, if part of me felt bad watching his life fall apart so completely. I thought about it honestly, about the 7 years I'd spent loving him, about the future I'd imagined we'd have together, about the trust I'd placed in him that he'd shattered so thoroughly. I didn't feel guilty at all. He'd made his choices. Every lie, every manipulation, every theft. Those were his decisions. I'd simply stopped allowing him to make me a victim of them. There's a difference between guilt and satisfaction in justice. I felt the latter. I ran into Becca one day at the grocery store. We both froze. She looked terrible, thin, exhausted, older than her 29 years. She apologized again, said she'd been stupid, that she should have known better, should have talked to me first. I agreed with both statements, but I also understood something I couldn't have seen before. She'd been a victim too. Not in the same way, but manipulated nonetheless. I didn't forgive her. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed her, but I stopped actively hating her. Hate requires energy I didn't want to spend on either of them anymore. I told her I hoped she learned from this, that she'd think twice before believing someone's story without verification, especially when that story painted someone else as a villain. She nodded, tears in her eyes. We parted ways. I don't expect we'll ever be friends again. That relationship died the moment she posted those beach photos. A year after everything started, I was doing better than I'd been in years. My design business was thriving. I'd taken all the money from the settlement and invested in better equipment and marketing. Clients were coming to me faster than I could handle. I hired an assistant, started turning down projects that didn't excite me. I'd also started dating again. Nothing serious, just casual coffee dates and dinners. Learning to trust my judgment again after having it so thoroughly betrayed. My sister worried I'd be too cautious, too afraid to open up. But I found the opposite was true. I knew what red flags looked like now. I knew how to verify what someone told me. I knew my worth and wouldn't settle for less than I deserved. One date, a guy named Trevor, made it to a third dinner. He was a high school teacher, kind and funny, with no ex-wife drama, and a clear employment history I'd absolutely verified before agreeing to a second date. On our third date, he asked about my marriage. I gave him the condensed version. He listened without interrupting, then said something that surprised me. He said it sounded like I'd handled everything perfectly, that a lot of people would have either taken him back or destroyed themselves trying to get revenge. But I'd simply documented, legally protected myself, and moved on. He called it admirable. I'd never thought of it that way. I'd just done what needed to be done. We dated for 6 months before I introduced him to my family. My sister loved him immediately. My parents were more cautious, worried about me getting hurt again. But Trevor was patient, understanding. He didn't push for more than I could give. And slowly, I found myself trusting him. Actually trusting him, not the blind trust I'd given my ex, but the earned kind that builds over time through consistent honesty. We got engaged a year after that. A small proposal, just us and a hiking trail and a ring that was exactly my style because he'd actually paid attention to what I liked. We planned a small wedding. Neither of us wanted a big production, just close family and real friends. 2 months before the wedding, I got a letter from prison. From him, my ex. I almost threw it away without reading it. My sister, who was there when it arrived, said I should read it just to know. So I did. It was an apology letter. 5 pages of how sorry he was, how he'd been a different person back then, how prison had given him time to reflect on his choices. He'd been wrong, he said. About everything. The lying, the cheating, the stealing. He took full responsibility. He understood if I couldn't forgive him. He just wanted me to know he was sorry and that he hoped I was happy. I read it twice, looking for the angle, the manipulation, but it seemed genuine as a letter from prison can be. I showed it to Trevor. He read it and asked what I wanted to do with it. I thought about it for a day. Then I wrote back, 1 paragraph. I told him I appreciated the apology, that I hoped he meant it and that he'd learned from his mistakes, that I was happy now, genuinely happy, and I wished him well in rebuilding his life after he served his time. I didn't forgive him in the letter. Forgiveness still wasn't something I felt ready to give, but I acknowledged his apology and left it at that. I never heard from him again. The wedding was perfect. Small ceremony, immediate family only, at a vineyard my sister had found. Trevor cried during the vows. So did I. But they were good tears. Happy tears. The kind that come from standing next to someone who sees you completely and chooses you anyway. During the reception, my dad pulled me aside. He admitted he'd never liked my ex. Had tried to tell himself it was just normal father-daughter protectiveness. But something had always felt off. He apologized for not trusting his gut. for not saying something sooner. I hugged him and told him it wasn't his fault, that I wouldn't have listened anyway. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. My mom gave me a different kind of advice during her mother-daughter dance. She said something I've thought about often since. She said that bad marriages can teach you more than good ones, that my first marriage had taught me what I wouldn't tolerate, had shown me my own strength, had prepared me to recognize and appreciate what I had now. She was right. I look back on that day I saw the beach photo and I'm grateful, not for the betrayal or the pain that followed, but for what it revealed, for how it forced me to advocate for myself, for how it burned away any illusions I had about who he was and showed me exactly what I deserved. The divorce taught me I was strong enough to walk away from 7 years of investment when it wasn't serving me. The fraud cases taught me that documentation and evidence matter more than emotional appeals. The healing process taught me that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, it means learning. Trevor and I have been married 3 years now. We have a small house with a garden I tend on weekends. My design business is more successful than ever. His students send him thank you notes that make him tear up. We go to therapy together occasionally, not because we have problems, but because we want to maintain good communication. We learned from my past. We don't take our relationship for granted. Sometimes people ask if I ever think about my ex, if I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to work it out instead of divorcing him immediately. The answer is no, not with regret anyway. I think about it academically, the way you might analyze a case study. What were the warning signs I missed? How did he manage to hide his true self for so long? What made me vulnerable to his manipulation? But I don't wonder what if, because I know exactly what would have happened. More lies, more theft, more betrayal. He wasn't going through a phase or having a crisis. That was who he was. The beach photo didn't change him. It just revealed him. My sister, who's since gotten engaged herself, asked me recently what advice I'd give to other women in similar situations. I thought about it for a while. Then I told her this. Trust your gut. Document everything. Don't let loyalty to who someone used to be blind you to who they are now. And remember that walking away from a bad situation isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. She wrote it down, said she'd remember if she ever needed it. I hope she never does, but I'm glad she asked. The story of my first marriage is done now, filed away in the past where it belongs. Sometimes I tell it to friends over wine, treating it like the cautionary tale it is. Sometimes months go by and I don't think about it at all. It's just a chapter that closed, a before to my after. The beach photo still exists somewhere, probably deleted from Becca's social media after everything came out, but captured in screenshots on my phone. I keep it in a folder labeled evidence, alongside all the other documentation from that time. I don't look at it, but I keep it. A reminder that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best transformations. People who know the whole story sometimes express sympathy. They say I went through something terrible, that they're sorry it happened to me. I appreciate the sentiment, but I've stopped seeing it as something that happened to me. It's something I survived, something I handled, something I learned from. There's power in that distinction. I saw Becca one more time after the grocery store encounter. She was at a mutual friend's wedding 2 years ago. We made eye contact across the reception hall. She looked away quickly. I didn't. I wasn't going to pretend she didn't exist, or that what happened hadn't happened, but I also wasn't going to let it ruin my evening. I was there with Trevor. We danced and laughed and celebrated our friend's happiness. Later that night, the bride mentioned that Becca had asked about me, wanted to know if I was happy. The bride had told her yes, very. Becca apparently said she was glad, that I deserved it. The bride asked if that bothered me, if I'd rather Becca not mention me at all. I said no. I meant it. I don't need Becca's approval or validation, but I'm not so bitter that I can't acknowledge a genuine expression of goodwill. She made terrible choices, betrayed our friendship, participated in damaging my marriage, but she was also manipulated, used, hurt in her own way. Holding on to anger about it only hurts me, not her. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I haven't forgotten, but I've forgiven enough to not let it poison my present. That's the thing about betrayal. You can either let it define you or refine you. I chose the latter. Trevor knows all of this, the whole ugly story. I told him early on, wanting him to understand where I was coming from, why I might be cautious, why I need transparency. He listened without judgment. Then he made sure every day since that I knew I could trust him, not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through being exactly who he claimed to be. That's what I learned from my first marriage. Words are easy. Actions tell the truth. My ex said all the right things while doing all the wrong ones. Trevor does the right things, and the words match. That's the difference. On our first anniversary, Trevor gave me a gift that made me cry. It was a custom photo album, empty pages ready to be filled with our future. On the first page, he'd written, "Every ending is a beginning. Here's to ours. We fill it together now." Pictures from trips we take. Silly selfies from random Tuesdays. Photos of the life we're building. Each page a reminder that the beach photo that ended my first chapter made room for these better ones. I don't believe everything happens for a reason. That's too neat. Too dismissive of real pain. But I do believe we can find meaning in what happens. Purpose in the aftermath. Strength in the survival. My first marriage ending wasn't fate. It was failure. His failure to be honest, to be faithful, to be the partner he'd promised to be. But my response to that failure? That was my choice. I chose documentation over drama, legal action over revenge, moving forward over staying stuck. and I'd make those choices again. The beach photo hangs in my mental gallery now. Not prominently, not somewhere I see it every day, but present enough to remember, to learn from, to remind me how far I've come, from the woman who stared at that image, heartbreaking, to the woman I am now, stronger, wiser, happier. That transformation, that's what makes the whole painful experience worth something. Not the pain itself, but what I built from it, who I became because of it. So when people ask if I regret marrying him, spending 7 years with someone who betrayed me so completely, my answer surprises them. I don't regret it. I learned from it. And those lessons made me ready for the real thing when it came along. The beach photo showed me an ending. I chose to see a beginning, and that more than anything else is what saved me. What I haven't told many people is what happened in the years between discovering the beach photo and where I am now. The full story is messier than the clean narrative I usually share. There were moments I'm not proud of, times I almost gave in to bitterness, days when getting out of bed felt impossible. The first month after I filed for divorce was the worst. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., and my brain replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I'd missed. I'd analyze conversations from years ago, looking for clues that he'd been capable of this level of deception. Some nights I'd find myself standing in the living room, staring at the empty space where his chair used to be, wondering how I'd been so blind. My sister moved in for 2 weeks during that time. She didn't ask permission, just showed up with a suitcase and her laptop, saying she was working remotely for a while. I knew what she was really doing. Making sure I ate, making sure I didn't spiral, making sure I remembered to shower and leave the apartment occasionally. She'd order takeout, and we'd eat in silence. She'd put on mindless TV shows and sit with me while I stared at the screen without really watching. She never pushed me to talk about it or move on faster than I could. She just existed beside me while I processed the destruction of my life as I'd known it. One night during that period, I did something I'm not proud of. I created a fake social media account and looked through his profiles, then Becca's, then started going through their followers, trying to figure out who knew, who had watched this happen and said nothing. I spent 4 hours doing this, working myself into a rage about people who weren't even part of the betrayal. My sister found me at 2 a.m. and still scrolling, my eyes burning from screen time and tears. She didn't lecture me, just closed the laptop and handed me a glass of water. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said that poison I was drinking, hoping it would hurt them, was only killing me, that they were off living their lives, probably not thinking about me at all, while I was destroying myself with anger. She was right, but knowing she was right and actually stopping were two different things. It took me another week to delete that fake account, another month to stop checking if they'd posted anything new. The obsession faded slowly, replaced by exhaustion, and then eventually by numbness, and finally by genuine disinterest. During the divorce proceedings, there were multiple times I wanted to do more than just file paperwork. I had his passwords. I knew where he kept important documents. I could have made his life significantly more difficult in petty ways. My sister said I was being too nice, that he deserved to suffer the way I was suffering. Maybe he did. But making him suffer wouldn't have made me feel better. It would have just prolonged my own agony. Every minute I spent thinking about revenge was a minute I wasn't spending rebuilding my life. So I kept it legal, kept it clean, focused on documentation and evidence rather than emotional retaliation. That restraint paid off. When his lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, mine could point to my reasonable behavior throughout the entire process. No harassment, no property damage, no public confrontations. Just a woman calmly protecting her interests through proper legal channels. But there were close calls. Once, I drove to Becca's apartment at midnight, fully intending to confront her. I sat in my car outside her building for an hour, practicing what I'd say. Imagining her face when I showed her all the evidence I'd compiled. I wanted to hurt her the way she'd hurt me. Wanted to watch her realize the full extent of what she'd done. I didn't go in. Not because I was being noble, but because my sister called right then. She'd somehow known, though I hadn't told her my plan. She talked to me for 45 minutes while I sat in that car, gradually talking me down from doing something I'd regret. By the time we hung up, the anger had drained into exhaustion. I drove home and went to bed. The next morning, I was grateful I hadn't gone in. Grateful I hadn't given them ammunition to use against me. Grateful I'd maintained the high road even when every instinct screamed to descend into the mud with them. The legal process revealed even more than I'd initially discovered. My lawyer subpoenaed his bank records, his phone records, everything. What we found was worse than the beach vacation. The affair had been going on for at least a year, possibly longer. The 8 months of money transfers I'd found were just what was easily traceable. There were cash withdrawals that probably went to her too. Over $40,000 total. He'd taken her on trips I didn't know about, claiming they were work conferences for the startup that was supposedly going to turn around. He'd bought her jewelry with our money. He'd rented an apartment for them both, separate from his temporary rental, where they'd been playing house while I waited at home for him to come back. Every new piece of evidence was a fresh betrayal, a new wound layered over the others. My lawyer would call with updates and I'd have to sit down, my legs unable to hold me as she detailed the latest discovery. She offered to stop telling me the details, just handle everything without my knowledge. I said no. I needed to know. Needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. Some of my friends didn't understand that. They said I was torturing myself by diving so deep into the evidence, that I should let the lawyer handle it and try to move on. But I couldn't move on without understanding, without knowing exactly what I was moving on from. The not knowing would have been worse than the knowing, even though the knowing was agony. The fraud case against him revealed his methods in detail. The fake text app was sophisticated. It could spoof any contact information, create entire conversation threads that looked authentic. He'd used it on multiple women, creating fictional exes or current girlfriends who abused him. He'd generate sympathy, then ask for money to escape these terrible situations. The detectives working the case said he'd been doing this for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Some of his victims came forward, others disappeared, probably too embarrassed to admit they'd been conned. The total amount he'd stolen was over $100,000. He'd been running this scam while married to me, using our legitimate relationship as cover. I had to testify at one of the preliminary hearings. Had to sit in a courtroom while his lawyer tried to make it seem like I was exaggerating or misremembering. Tried to suggest that maybe I'd known about the other women and was now lying about it to avoid looking foolish. My lawyer objected. The judge sustained it, but the implication hung in the air. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt dirty, tainted by association with him, like his crimes had somehow transferred to me just by being married to him. My sister was waiting outside and I broke down completely, right there on the courthouse steps, sobbing while people walked around us. She got me to the car and we sat there for an hour while I cried, not just about him, but about everything, about the life I'd thought I was building, about the naivety that had made me believe his lies, about the 7 years I'd invested in someone who'd never really existed. The man I'd married had been a character he was playing, and I'd never even realized I was watching a performance. The therapy helped, though it took me months to find the right therapist. The first one wanted to focus on my childhood, looking for root causes of why I'd chosen him. The second one kept pushing me to forgive before I was ready. The third one finally understood what I needed. Not someone to fix me, but someone to witness my pain without trying to rush me through it. We talked about trust and betrayal, about how trauma reshapes your perception of reality, about the difference between healing and just covering up wounds. She never pushed me toward any particular outcome, never suggested I should forgive him, or that I was being too harsh. She just helped me process what had happened and figure out who I wanted to be on the other side of it. One session, about 8 months in, she asked me what I was most angry about. I'd been talking about the money, the affair, the lies, but she pushed deeper. What was underneath all of that? What was the core injury? I realized it wasn't the cheating itself. It was the erasure. He'd rewritten our entire relationship in his mind, turned me into a villain to justify his choices. He'd taken 7 years of genuine love and care from me and twisted it into something ugly, made it meaningless. That was what hurt most. Not that he'd left, but that he'd retroactively destroyed what we'd had by pretending it had never been real. Understanding that helped. Not immediately, but gradually. It helped me separate what had actually happened from what he'd claimed happened. My love had been real. My commitment had been real. His wasn't, but that didn't negate mine. I hadn't wasted 7 years. I'd loved genuinely, even if it had been unreciprocated. There's no shame in that. The day the divorce was finalized should have felt triumphant, but it mostly felt empty. I sat in the courtroom while the judge approved our settlement, watching my ex-husband sign papers that ended our marriage. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like all his lies had been holding him up, and now that they'd collapsed, he'd shrunk. He tried to catch my eye as we left. I didn't look at him. There was nothing left to say. No closure to be found in eye contact. The legal documents were our final conversation. My parents took me to dinner that night. They were relieved it was over, hoping I'd immediately bounce back to my old self. I tried to explain that legal finalization wasn't emotional resolution, that I was better, but not healed. They meant well, but they couldn't quite understand why I wasn't ready to celebrate. My sister understood. She came over later that night after our parents had left, found me sitting on the floor surrounded by papers, sorting through what to keep and what to shred. She sat down beside me and we went through everything together. Marriage certificate, lease agreements, insurance documents, every piece of paper that tied me to him. We built a fire in the fireplace, something I rarely used, and we burned it all. Every document that wasn't legally required, every photo I'd cut myself out of, every piece of physical evidence of our marriage. We watched it burn, and neither of us spoke. Sometimes destruction is necessary for creation. The next morning, I woke up feeling different, lighter, like I'd been carrying weight I hadn't realized was there and had finally set it down. The divorce was done. The legal battles were finished. The evidence was compiled and submitted. There was nothing left to do except move forward. That's when I hired my assistant. When I started taking my business seriously as a business, not just a side hustle I did to support his dreams. I raised my rates, started marketing professionally, built a website that showcased my actual skills instead of underselling myself. Clients responded. Within 3 months, I doubled my income. Within 6, I was making more than I ever had, even with his sporadic contributions. I hired a second assistant, rented a small office space, established boundaries between work and home that I'd never had when trying to be available whenever he needed me. My calendar filled with projects I actually wanted to work on. My portfolio expanded with work I was proud of. For the first time in years, I felt competent, capable. Like I was building something real instead of just treading water while someone else pursued their dreams on my dime. That's when I started dating again. Not because I was over everything, but because I was ready to test myself, to see if I could still connect with someone, if I could trust my judgment, if I was permanently damaged or just temporarily wounded. The first few dates were disasters. I saw red flags everywhere. A guy who was 10 minutes late must be hiding something. A guy who paid for dinner must expect something in return. A guy who didn't text back immediately must be playing games. I was so hypervigilant that I couldn't relax enough to actually get to know anyone. My sister pointed out that I was self-sabotaging, that not every man was my ex, that I needed to find a middle ground between blind trust and total suspicion. She was right, but knowing that and actually doing it were different things. Trevor was the first person I managed to relax around, maybe because he was so transparently himself. No games, no angles, just a straightforward guy who liked his job and his friends and was looking for someone to share life with. He asked me out after we met at a mutual friend's birthday party. I almost said no, then decided to try one more time. That first coffee date lasted 4 hours. We talked about teaching, about design, about books and movies, and whether dogs or cats made better pets. Nothing deep or serious. Just conversation. When it ended, he asked if I wanted to do it again. I surprised myself by saying yes. The second date, he asked about my past. I gave him the extremely condensed version. Divorced, messy situation, still processing. He nodded and said that made sense. Didn't push for details, didn't run away either. Just acknowledged it and moved on. By the third date, I felt comfortable enough to tell him more. About the beach photo. About discovering the affair. About the fake text messages and the fraud charges. I watched his face carefully while I talked, looking for judgment or discomfort or any sign that this was too much. He listened until I finished. Then he said that I'd handled it well. That a lot of people would have fallen apart or gotten bitter or done something they regretted. That choosing the legal route and protecting myself showed strength. It wasn't what I expected him to say. Most people offered sympathy or anger on my behalf. He offered respect. We kept dating, slowly. No rush to define what we were or where it was going. Just seeing each other regularly, learning about each other, building something genuine. After about 3 months, I realized I trusted him. Not blindly, but reasonably. He was who he said he was. Consistent. Honest. Present. 6 months in, I told him I loved him. He said it back. We moved in together after a year. Got engaged 6 months after that. Every step felt right. Not perfect or magical, but right. Like we were building something sustainable instead of something romantic but unstable. His family welcomed me immediately. His mom especially seemed to understand without me having to explain. At one family dinner, she pulled me aside and said her first marriage had been rough too, that she understood what it was like to rebuild yourself after someone tried to break you down, that I was stronger than I knew. I appreciated that. The acknowledgement that strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about what you do after. Planning our wedding was different the second time. No pressure to make it perfect or Instagram-worthy. No stress about impressing anyone. Just a small gathering of people we actually cared about. Celebrating something real. My sister was my maid of honor. Trevor's best friend stood as his best man. We wrote our own vows. Mine focused on choice. On how love is not just a feeling but a daily decision to show up for each other. On how trust is built through consistent actions, not promises. On how I chose him every day and would keep choosing him. Trevor cried. So did my dad. Trevor's vows were about partnership. About building a life together instead of parallel lives. About supporting each other's dreams instead of sacrificing for them. About being a team. When he finished, I realized that's what had been missing in my first marriage. Partnership. We'd been 2 people living together, not 2 people building together. Our honeymoon was simple. A cabin in the mountains, no Wi-Fi, just us and nature. We hiked and read and talked about the future we were building, about the house we wanted to buy, about whether we wanted kids, about retirement dreams and 5-year plans. All the conversations I'd tried to have with my ex that he'd always deflected or dismissed. Coming back from that honeymoon, I felt complete in a way I never had before. Not because Trevor completed me, that's not how it works, but because I'd completed myself, and now I was sharing that whole person with someone who appreciated all of it. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, learning to navigate joint decisions, joint finances, joint everything, but it was easier than I expected, because we talked about things. We established systems that worked for both of us. We compromised when we disagreed. It was almost boring how healthy it was. My business continued to grow. I moved into a larger office space, hired 2 more assistants and a junior designer, started turning down projects regularly because we were booked months in advance. The financial security that came with that growth was healing in its own way, proof that I was capable of building something stable. Trevor got promoted to department head at his school. He came home exhausted most days, dealing with teenage drama and administrative headaches, but he never took it out on me, never made his stress my problem. We'd talk about his day, I'd talk about mine, and we'd figure out together how to decompress. 2 years into our marriage, we bought a house, a small 3-bedroom with a yard and a garden. I planted vegetables and flowers, things I'd never had space or time for before. Trevor built raised beds and a compost bin. We spent weekends working on the house, making it ours. Every project was a joint decision, a joint effort. That's when I realized I'd stopped thinking about my ex regularly. Months would go by without him crossing my mind. The anger had faded completely. The hurt was scarred over. He'd become just a fact of my history, not an active presence in my thoughts. My sister got married around that time. I stood as her maid of honor, watching her marry someone who looked at her the way Trevor looks at me, with respect and affection and partnership. At the reception, we toasted to happy endings and new beginnings. She told me later that watching my journey had taught her what to look for in a partner, what to accept, and what to refuse. I was glad something good had come from all that pain. Mom's words at my wedding proved true. The bad marriage had taught me more than a good one would have. It had shown me my own resilience, had taught me what real love looks like by showing me what fake love looks like, had prepared me to recognize and appreciate the real thing. 3 years into our marriage, Trevor and I talked seriously about kids. We both wanted them eventually, but we wanted to be sure our foundation was solid first. We spent 6 months discussing it. The practical aspects, the emotional aspects, what kind of parents we wanted to be. When we finally decided we were ready, it felt like a team decision, not something one of us was pushing for while the other reluctantly agreed. I got pregnant 4 months later. The pregnancy was hard, lots of morning sickness and complications, but Trevor was there for every appointment, every midnight craving, every moment of anxiety. He took parenting classes with me, read books about infant care, built the nursery. It was everything I'd imagined partnership would be, and never had the first time around. Our daughter was born on a Tuesday in April. She had Trevor's eyes and my stubbornness, apparently, according to the nurses. Holding her for the first time, I felt a completeness I hadn't known was possible. This tiny person, created from actual love and partnership. She deserved parents who chose each other every day, and that's what we were giving her. Mom came to help for the first 2 weeks. She'd watch the baby while I showered or napped. She'd cook meals and do laundry and all the things new moms need but are too exhausted to ask for. One night, while I was feeding the baby, she told me she was proud of me. Not just for having a baby, but for having the strength to leave my first marriage when I did. For building this life I had now. She admitted she'd been worried after the divorce, worried I'd become bitter or closed off or unable to trust again. But watching me with Trevor and now our daughter, she could see I'd done the work to heal, that I'd chosen to grow from the pain instead of being destroyed by it. I appreciated her saying that. Sometimes you need someone else to witness your growth to fully see it yourself. Dad had a different conversation with me. He'd been quietly furious about my ex throughout the entire divorce, had wanted to confront him multiple times. Mom had talked him out of it, telling him I needed legal support, not emotional revenge, but he'd held on to that anger for years. Meeting his granddaughter softened something in him. He said that if my first marriage hadn't ended, I wouldn't have this life now, wouldn't have Trevor or the baby or the peace I'd found. He could let go of his anger because the universe had balanced out in my favor eventually. I understood what he meant, though I didn't quite agree. The universe hadn't balanced anything. I'd done the work to rebuild. I'd made choices that led to better outcomes. It wasn't fate or karma. It was me, choosing myself, over and over until the choosing got easier. Our daughter's first year was exhausting and wonderful. Trevor took paternity leave and we navigated new parenthood together. Late nights and early mornings and all the chaos that comes with a tiny human. But we did it as a team. When one of us was overwhelmed, the other stepped in. We asked for help when we needed it. We didn't try to be perfect, just present. My business slowed down during that year. I'd planned for it, saved appropriately, delegated what I could. My assistants handled most of the day-to-day while I focused on major clients and parenting. It was the first time in my adult life I'd prioritized something over work, and it felt right. By her second birthday, we'd found our rhythm. Work and life balanced reasonably well. The baby slept through most nights. Trevor and I still made time for just us. Date nights every other week, keeping our relationship alive beneath the parenting responsibilities. That's when I saw Becca one more time. We ran into each other at a children's museum. She was there with her sister's kids. I was there with my daughter. We both froze. Then I decided to just handle it like adults. I said hi. She said hi back, commented on how cute my daughter was. I thanked her. We made small talk for about 3 minutes. Weather, how parenting is harder than expected, polite nothings. Then she said she was glad I seemed happy, that I deserved it after everything. I thanked her and said I hoped she was doing well too. We parted ways. The whole interaction was painfully civil and completely empty of the friendship we'd once had. After she left, Trevor asked if I was okay. I realized I was. Seeing her didn't hurt anymore, didn't anger me. She was just someone I used to know who'd made terrible choices. Those choices had consequences, including losing our friendship. But they'd also inadvertently freed me from a marriage that was always going to end badly. I'd ended it on my terms instead of wasting more years. I couldn't thank her for that. The hurt she'd caused was real, the betrayal genuine. But I could acknowledge that unintentionally, her actions had helped me in the long run. Not because I believed everything happens for a reason, but because I'd chosen to build something better from the wreckage. Our daughter started preschool at 3. The first day, dropping her off, I felt simultaneously proud and terrified. This tiny person we'd made, going out into the world. Trevor held my hand while we watched her run to the play area without looking back. He said that was a good sign, that she felt secure enough to explore. I thought about that a lot. About security and exploration. About how you need a safe base to return to before you can venture out confidently. That's what Trevor and I were building for her. What we were building for ourselves. A safe base that made the rest of life possible. Work picked back up after she started school. New clients, bigger projects, more revenue. I hired a business manager to handle operations so I could focus on the creative work I actually enjoyed. The business became something that supported our life instead of consuming it. Another lesson learned from before. Work matters, but it's not everything. Trevor and I talked about having another baby. We wanted our daughter to have a sibling. Wanted to do the whole parenting thing again, now that we had some idea what we were doing. We got pregnant again when she was 4. Another girl, born on a Sunday in October. Two daughters who'd grow up knowing what healthy love looks like because they saw it every day in their parents. That's not something I could have given them with my ex. Even if we'd had children, they would have grown up watching dysfunction disguised as normal, watching me bend myself into smaller and smaller shapes trying to make him happy, learning that love means sacrifice instead of partnership. I saved them from that by leaving, by choosing myself, by refusing to settle for less than I deserved. They'll never know the alternative they avoided, but I do. And I'm grateful every day that I had the strength to walk away when I did. 5 years into my marriage with Trevor, someone asked me if I considered myself lucky, if I'd just happened to find the right person the second time. I said no. Luck implies chance, randomness, things beyond my control. I'd done the work to heal, to understand myself, to learn what healthy love looks like. That work prepared me to recognize Trevor when I met him, to not self-sabotage when things were going well, to build something sustainable. The first marriage taught me what to avoid. The divorce taught me my own strength. The healing taught me how to be a partner. Trevor didn't save me. I saved myself. He's just the person I chose to share my saved self with. That distinction matters. It's the difference between being a victim of circumstance and being an agent in your own life. My ex tried to make me the former. I chose to be the latter. Every decision I made after seeing that beach photo was about reclaiming my agency, about refusing to let his actions define my future. Now, 7 years after that beach photo, I have a life I couldn't have imagined then, a husband who's actually a partner, 2 daughters who are growing up secure and loved, a business I'm proud of, a home that feels safe, friendships that are genuine, all of it built from the ashes of what burned down. People sometimes tell me they're going through similar situations, discovering affairs, facing divorces, trying to figure out how to rebuild. They ask for advice. I tell them what my sister told me. The poison you drink hoping to hurt them only hurts you. Document everything. Protect yourself legally. Feel your feelings, but don't let them dictate your actions. And remember that walking away isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. Some listen. Some aren't ready to hear it. I understand both. You can't force someone to leave before they're ready. You can only offer support when they finally are. My ex is out of prison now. Served 4 years of a 7-year sentence, got out early for good behavior. I know this because one of his victims reached out to warn me, said he'd been asking about me, trying to find out where I lived. I thanked her for the heads up and filed a restraining order. He violated it once, showing up at my office. The police arrested him. He's back in jail for another 6 months. Some people don't learn, don't change, can't see past their own needs to consider how they impact others. He's one of those people. I feel sorry for him in an abstract way, the way you might feel sorry for anyone trapped in their own worst impulses. But I don't feel responsible for him. His choices are his own. That was maybe the hardest lesson that I wasn't responsible for his behavior. Not during our marriage, not during the affair, not during the fraud schemes. He was an adult making adult choices. I could control my responses, but not his actions. Accepting that lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Trevor once asked me if I'd change anything if I could go back. If I'd avoid my ex entirely, never marry him, skip all the pain. I thought about it honestly. Said no, because that pain shaped who I became, taught me lessons I needed to learn, made me someone capable of appreciating what I have now. I don't recommend pain as a teaching tool. Wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But since it happened anyway, I'm glad I extracted every possible lesson from it. Glad I didn't waste the pain by staying bitter or becoming cynical. Glad I transformed it into wisdom, instead of letting it transform me into someone I didn't want to be. That's my answer to the beach photo now. Not anger or hurt or betrayal, just acceptance. It happened. It revealed things that needed to be revealed. It ended something that needed to end, and it freed me to build something better. That's enough. The story doesn't end with vengeance or vindication or the ex realizing what he lost. It ends with me realizing what I gained, a life I actually want, a partnership that actually works, children who will grow up knowing what love should look like. That's the real ending. Not him getting what he deserved, but me getting what I worked for. And every time I look at my life now, at Trevor and our daughters and the home we've built, I'm grateful. Not for what happened, but for what I did with what happened. That's the only power we really have. Not to control what others do to us, but to control who we become in response. I chose to become someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who knows her worth and won't accept less. The beach photo showed me who he really was. Everything after showed me who I really am, and I like who I found.